This week we are going to look at some of the key points from Chapter 3 in the text. Due to the amount of information in Chapter 3, I'm actually going to be breaking down the material into two parts. In this part, we will look at the reformism and the early legislation of the 1900s. This area has historically been a complex one, as a variety of social factors and motives have strongly influenced drug regulation and legislation. An overview of what we will cover is 1. What is being targeted with the legislation? For example, only certain substances, recreational use only, medicinal use. 2. Who is doing the regulating? 3. The motives for regulation, for example, public safety, generating revenue. And lastly, the impact legislation has had and currently has on society. Recently, we discussed the shift from a laissez-faire policy to one of stricter control and reform. What surfaced in the reformism period involved the creation of legislation targeting substances and substance use. The legislation during the 1900s was considered groundbreaking and initiated a new perspective on both recreational and medicinal use. Additionally, strong influences of racism, societal beliefs, and judgments regarding quote-unquote deviant drug use played a major role in what and who was being targeted with the legislations. Lastly, the reformism focus was largely about creating laws to regulate what many deemed at that time to be an undesirable behavior and or restrict access to certain substances. When looking at the specific issues leading to legislation, there were three major areas of concern that caused passage of legislation related to each area. The first involved fraud in patent medicines. Patent medicines were often sold by traveling salesmen door to door from city to city who presented these medicines with grand claims of curing abilities, but with very little information. The reality was the majority of these therapeutic claims were false, and habit-forming ingredients such as alcohol and cocaine were a main ingredient, usually an unlisted ingredient. Eventually, the high levels of fraud in the patent medicine industry received public and governmental attention largely due to a piece of investigative journalism from Collier's magazine. This magazine produced a series called The Great American Fraud, which detailed the shady tactics of the patent medicine industry. The second area was opium. In the 1800s, the opium trade was lucrative for both American and British merchants. In addition, opium use, particularly opium smoking, was increasing. The reformism era ushered in disapproval of these practices. As a result, a treaty to both control and regulate opium was signed and moves to outlaw opium dens on both a local and national level spread. Questions around anti-Chinese sentiment during that era as a strong motive for these laws has been raised. Additionally, the laws actually created a ripple effect as both the cost of opium on the street and the use of morphine and heroin increased. The last area of concern was cocaine. With purer form and increased availability as outlined in the text, reformers demanded greater control. To generate support for their cause, racist and unsubstantiated claims focusing on the African American population were spread. The result was increased fears over who was using cocaine and the potential for acts of violence. The propaganda attempts proved to be successful, as many governmental officials in the South supported federal drug control laws for cocaine. With the reformism era and the growing request for federal legislation, two important acts were passed. The first was the Pure Food and Drugs Act of 1906, and the second was the Harrison Act of 1914. These were historical acts that still impact us today. Before getting to the main points of each act, it is important to note that each of these laws were overseen and regulated by a different bureau of the government. This is important because the goals and focus varied widely due to the bureau. The Pure Food and Drugs Act was initially overseen by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and would shift to what is now known as the FDA. And the focus was ensuring public safety by requiring things such as accurate labeling, lists of ingredients, and prohibited commerce of adulterated or mislabeled products. The Harrison Act was monitored by the U.S. Treasury Department, which looked at ways to tax certain drugs for a revenue source for the government. In addition, the motives around the Harrison Act have been questioned due to a desire to use the act as a way to gain favored trade status with China. Taking a closer look at the acts, we'll start first with the 1906 Pure Food and Drugs Act. The main focus was on the regulation of pharmaceuticals, and we can break it down into three specific areas. The first area, targeted in 1906, was with the Act and lasted through the 1920s. This target area was purity, and the Department of Agriculture stated that the contents of a product must be accurately listed on the label. To do this, it attempted to encourage voluntary cooperation and compliance. The USDA also created ways to test products and outlawed the practice of making false claims on labels. The next target area was safety and occurred during the 1930s through the beginning of the 1950s. This is when the FDA is officially named and becomes the regulator of the Act. Safety became a main concern because prior to this time there was no legal requirement that medications be safe. Under additions to the original Act, requirements such as pre-market testing for toxicity became required, and companies were now required to submit what was termed a New Drug Application, or NDA, to the FDA for approval. The FDA required that medications have adequate instructions for the consumer or only be offered through a physician prescription. The last target area for the Act occurred throughout the 50s and 60s with a focus on effectiveness. The FDA wanted to ensure that pharmaceuticals were not just pure and safe, but also effective, meaning doing what they claimed they could do. Additions to the original Act implemented consumer precautions such as pre-approval before human testing, provision of information concerning adverse reactions, and demonstrated effectiveness. In this era, the FDA became not just the overseer of the Act, but actually became involved with reviewing for effectiveness. If deemed ineffective, the FDA would call for its removal. Lastly, this was the area that created the specific steps as outlined in the text for research and marketing of a new drug. Turning to the 1914 Harrison Act, this act provided for the registration of and taxing of opium and cocaine. This meant that anyone who produced, imported, and prescribed had to register annually, pay a tax, and use special order forms provided by the IRS. In essence, this was a tax act. Its passage, greatly influenced by the measures taken by Dr. Wright to gain favored trade status, is viewed as the beginning to federally controlled regulation of substances. In this act, we again see the use of a racist public campaign to generate support and passage, largely by provoking emotions and fear. Initially, the Harrison Act focused on taxation and arrest efforts focused on smugglers. However, this changed significantly with what is outlined in the text concerning the arrest and conviction of Dr. Webb for taking any and all phone orders for opioids. The last area to consider in part 1 is, well, what about prohibition? Wasn't that an important act? While similarities exist, such as the Treasury Department enforcing prohibition and a major focus on preventing access to a substance, in this case alcohol, what is often viewed as the most well-known quote-unquote drug law of the 1900s wasn't actually a drug law. With the exception of the Volstead Act, which was a precursor to prohibition, the government's approach to an eventual repeal of alcohol prohibition wasn't actually drug legislation per se, but amendments to the Constitution. However, this is an important area, and we will be coming back to the topic of prohibition when we cover the chapter on alcohol in the text.